amongst others, have gathered Jesus. They've put him into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. They've wrapped his body in linen and covered him in spices, as is common for Jewish burial custom. A stone is placed across the front of the tomb, and guards are set in place to guard the tomb. And then that Easter morning, Mary and some other women, just as light is breaking, they sort of make their way down to the tomb. They're not sure how they're going to get the door open. They're not sure how they're going to remove the stone. All they know is they want to come and they want to finish the burial. They want to do the preparation. When they get there, what they discover is not what they expected. They find that the stone's being rolled away and the tomb is empty. And what do the women do? They turn to each other and one says, "Christ is risen," and the other says, "He's risen indeed." No, it's not actually what happened at all. It's not what they said at all. They actually, what happens is they get there and they assume that the body is stolen. They get there and they assume the Jewish authorities, the enemies of Christ, have stolen his body for some particular reason. And they're absolutely devastated. And so they run off and they tell the apostles that are gathered that what has happened. They've got to the tomb and the tomb's empty. And then they say, "Oh, well, Christ is risen. He's risen indeed." It's not what they said at all. They sort of don't believe it. They assume that perhaps the body's being stolen as well. And so what happens is they run down, Peter and John, they run down to the tomb. And if you read Gospel of John wants to know he's a bit faster than Peter. He gets there first, right? Just Peter runs in, but John's a faster runner. Just so you know, it must be true because it's in the Bible and John wanted us to know. So they get down there and they get into the tomb. And no one understands what's happening. Mary returns a bit later. She's weeping. She's not understanding what's going on. Perhaps she wants to have some sense of closure. You know, when you're grieving the passing of someone, sometimes you want to go just by the tomb. You want to, the people talk about being there at a graveside or spreading ashes or some sort of closure. And maybe because of the hurried events of the Friday, she hasn't felt she's had closure and she's turned up there. She expected to see the tomb. She expected to go in to prepare his body, to pay her last respects, and she's been denied that. And so she's there at the tomb and she's just waiting. She doesn't know what to do. And as she's weeping, these angels appear. And they have this conversation. But she still doesn't believe that the dead rise. She's still unconvinced about what's going on because dead people don't rise. She has questions, she has doubts about what's going on. And maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you come here and you have some doubts. You've had confidence in God in the past, but you don't have confidence in God now. You're not sure about him now. Maybe your life hit some turbulence. Maybe you went through something rough. Maybe there's an obstacle or a barrier and your faith started to unravel. Things did not turn out the way that you expected them to turn out. Maybe you had great faith until a spouse or a loved one died. You had great faith until that biopsy turned up negative. Maybe you had great faith until your parents got divorced. You're walking with God strong and then you got ill, you lost your job, you were let down by a friend. And these doubts arise about God and what is he doing in this world. And it's harder to see Jesus. But for whatever reason, she's there, she's weeping, she's got these doubts, her faith is sort of rocked, and then Jesus appears. And she doesn't actually even know what to do initially. She doesn't recognize him. It's really interesting because you read other resurrection appearances and they don't seem to recognize Jesus immediately. And so she sees him, in some accounts she thinks he was a gardener. They have a conversation. And then he says her name, and then she says Rabboni, which means teacher. And she recognizes who he is. And then she runs off and she tells the disciples. And they say, Christ is risen. She says, Christ is risen. And they say, he's risen indeed. No. It's just not there in the story. That's not how it went. She goes and tells them they aren't sure. Listen to verse 11, Luke 24. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. So if you have confusion about the Easter events, if you think, what do I do with this story? If you have questions about God and you're saying the whole story about God coming to earth and living a perfect life and going across and dying on our behalf and raising again on the third day, if you have questions about that, if sometimes that feels like nonsense to you, then you're not alone. It's written all over this story. They have questions. And later the day, Jesus did appear to the followers as they were gathered and they were locked in this room. And listen to what happens there. Verses 36 to 39. While they're still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Did you see it? Did you hear the question that Jesus asked? Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? And so there's this moment of doubt in this story. And who's not there? Thomas, right? So often we assume Thomas is the doubting one. I mean, Thomas gets his own story. But Thomas isn't there. Listen to Thomas's story. Ains read it for us a moment ago. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord," but he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I would not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, but yet have believed." See, I want to defend Thomas a little bit because Thomas isn't the only one that doubted. And yet we always say doubting Thomas, don't we? How about doubting Bartholomew or doubting Thaddeus or doubting Andrew? Because they all doubted, they all had questions. And Thomas isn't actually saying that he won't believe. What he's saying is, I think, something that we so often say. He's saying, "I just need something more. I'm just not going to have placed my faith on your faith. I have questions that I have to have answered. There are things that I need to know and that I need to experience before." He's not saying he won't believe. He's just saying, "I just need something more." And maybe that's you. Maybe you know that experience. Everybody tells you what you ought to believe, but you've got a question that you've got to have answered. There's an experience that you've got to know for yourself. There's something that's nagging away, and if you can just answer that question or have that experience or have that reality known to you in some way, you go, "Oh, I get it." And that's Thomas. Thomas isn't saying, "There's no way I won't believe ever." He was just saying, "Unless I see." Right? You guys are telling me what you saw. He goes, I want to see it. And see, faith can't be a second-hand experience. I think Thomas is onto something here. You and I, we can't live our faith vicariously through somebody else. Ultimately, it's got to be our faith, our choice. And whatever you need to do to resolve that, dare to ask that question. If you've got some doubts, work through them. Fight with them, wrestle with them. That's what Thomas has to do. Because sometimes doubt, and what I love about Thomas' story, it's not like Thomas doubted and that's the end of the story. He sort of sails off in the sunset and we go, and Thomas was never heard of from again. Thomas believed. But doubt was not the end of his faith. It just led him to a deeper personal faith. Because he had to explore and wrestle with his uncertainty. He had to have this answered for himself. And so this morning I want to talk about doubt. Because I think the Easter story, when you look at it, is littered with doubt. we walk in, and so often in this church, in many churches, we do say that phrase, Christ is risen indeed, as if that is a self-evident truth. And yet that is not necessarily the experience of most people. It's actually quite normal to question. It's not quite normal to have doubts. It's quite normal to say, what do I do with this thing? It seems unbelievable. And yet if it's true, it changes everything. And so today is a story about Jesus who rose from the dead. And there's probably some people here who think this sounds like a crazy story. It sounds like nonsense. If this sounds like nonsense to you, as we heard before, it sounded like nonsense to the 11 when they first heard it. It's a normal human reaction. In Matthew 28, we have this moment, this sort of penultimate moment where Jesus is with his disciples. He's resurrected, he's on this mountaintop. And the 11 remain, and these are the 11 that have walked with him. They've seen him feed 5,000. They've seen him walk on water. They've seen him calm storms. They've seen him make the blind see and the lame walk and the deaf hear and the mute speak. And they've seen him raise the dead. They've seen him do all these sorts of things. And now here they are, and they're on top of a mountain. They've watched him get arrested. They've watched him get beaten. They've watched him die. And here they are now standing with the resurrected Jesus. And we have this great moment. It's Matthew 28, verses 16 to 17. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Do you see it? I'll put it in bold so you could. Who knew that was in the story? We expect him to worship, don't we? But some doubt it. After all they've seen, after all they've experienced, and here they are on the mountain with the resurrected Jesus, and you've got some that get it and they're at his feet and they are worshipping him. But there are others in this story that doubt. And I think that's what this day does. Easter Sunday polarizes people. Have you noticed? It either fires you up or people just think you're insane to be believing that this actually happened. That's what it does. It either moves you to worship or it moves you to doubt. That's what Easter Sunday does. And that's what the experience here is of the resurrected Jesus. But I love that line's there because I tell you what, if this was PR and propaganda, if this is myth and legend, if we're just making this up to advance a particular story, you don't put that line in, do you? That line ain't helping, is it? Right? But some doubted. If you're trying to advance an argument that Jesus is Lord of Lords, Kings of Kings, he's a Messiah, he's a resurrected one, you don't include the line. But some doubted. But if you're as accurately as you can retelling the events that happened at that time, you say, here's the truth. We're on a mountain. Some of us are worshipping and some are questioning. And sometimes we have these perspectives, that we have these views of reality that we become so entrenched in that we find it hard to shift our thinking despite the evidence that lays in front of us. And so when they see a resurrected Jesus, they're thinking, well, dead men don't rise. What do we do with this? Even when it's plain for them to see what is going on, they can see the nail marks in his hands, in his feet. They could see the wound in his side. They could see all this evidence that this is the Jesus they know. But they have doubts. And I think it raises a question. Where does doubt come from? Because we all experience it at different times. And could it be that doubt comes from assumptions that we think we know how things work or how they ought to work? I got to admit, I never thought I would ever do what I'm about to do. On Easter Sunday, I'm about to quote Richard Dawkins, the atheist. Listen to what he says. I cannot know for certain, but I think God is very improbable. And I live my life on the assumption that he's not there. See what he's saying? It may actually be true, but I don't know. But I have a particular worldview. I have a way in which I see reality that I will ignore it. I'll live my life on the assumption that this is not true. He's already decided in his mind up that this doesn't happen. And so anything that might be counter to his worldview, he will assume is not true. In 1962, there was a well-known book by Thomas Kuhn. It was called The Structure of the Scientific Revolution. It was written in 1962. I think it's about 4 different reprints or revised editions since then. And in this book, what he actually says is that he said that scientists actually have, and he's talking about the scientific world, have this natural inclination to reinforce already set beliefs. He calls it paradigms. He's saying scientists actually have that they have a particular view of the way things work, and often when new information comes, when new discoveries are to be found, often they won't change their thinking. It's not because there isn't new information that might challenge the prevailing thinking, but we get so set in our ways that we ignore it. For thousands of years, humanity thought the world was flat. And then all of a sudden there was information saying the world is actually round. And what did people do? They flattened the information because it didn't fit the paradigm. I actually still know people that still think the world is flat. Right? They're convinced that the world is flat. What do? Despite all the evidence to the contrary, they flatten it. They flatten the information because this is how, for them, the world works. And anything that comes in, any discovery, no matter how true it is, no matter how self-evident it is, if that doesn't fit in my paradigm, what I'll do is I'll push that out. I'll flatten that out. I'll ignore that. And Kuhn says that we filter out information, important information. In fact, sometimes we distort that information if it doesn't fit our particular worldview. See, don't take doubts at face value. They don't take doubts at face value. We need to allow this new information sometimes to challenge the way we think. And that's why the first Easter we find doubt, because what's happening is here's Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, but we all know this is not the way it works. This is not the way it happens. People don't rise from the grave. And there are some things and times about faith that are hard to resolve. And so sometimes we just want to ignore the challenges God brings our way. As I said, if the gospel writers are into PR and embellishment, they don't have, and some doubt it. But they say, hey, here's the reality. Despite the new information, despite the resurrected Jesus standing in their midst, despite them being able to see his hands and his feet, there's some that will doubt because that's human nature. And it's not always that I don't think it's even always that there's like the worship is over here and the doubt is over here. I think sometimes the reality is sometimes we're worshipping and sometimes we go, but I've got questions, I've got doubts. Yeah, but that experience is like, I know I'm meant to believe that, but I've got questions over here because it feels like things ought to work this way, but the evidence keeps telling me that it works this way. And it's normal. That is normal. If you're here this morning and you're saying, I don't know what camp I'm in. I don't know if I want to believe and I don't know if I want to doubt. I'm sort of ebbing between the two. That's human nature. That's a human experience. In September in 2014, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Most Reverend Justin Welby, said that at times he questioned if God was really there. And there was the International Business Times ran a headline called "The Doubt of the Century." How could like an archbishop have any doubts about God? They thought it was untenable. And Welby said, they actually just quoted, and all it was, he was just preaching or speaking at Bristol Cathedral. And this is what he said: "Is there a God? Where is God?" And then he was asked specifically if he ever harbored doubts, and he responded, "It's a really good question. The other day I was praying over something,
as I was running. And I end up saying to God, look, this is all very well, but isn't it about time you said something, if you're there, which probably is not what an Archbishop of Canterbury should say. That was it. That was like the doubt of the century. Okay. What is he? He's just human. He has these moments where he's saying, God, this isn't working out the way that I thought it would. If you were who I thought you were, I thought you would act this way, and you seem to be working in a way that's a little different to the way I expected, so I don't know what to do with that. And yet he's gone through all sorts of hardship. Welby had actually lost in 1983. His 7-month-old daughter, Joanna, died in a car accident. He was raised in an alcoholic family. He had reason for doubt at different times. It's human nature to have doubts. If you doubt, you're a human. The thing, what the Times didn't understand, they thought having a doubt defined him. It didn't define him. He wasn't stuck there. It's just having doubts is to be humans. In Matthew 14, there's a very familiar story where Jesus is walking on water, and Matthew joins him. And we all know how this story ends. You know, we all love the part that not only was Jesus walking on water, not only was Peter walking with Jesus on the water, but then Peter started to sink. We sort of really like that part of the story. Because I think it's a very human moment. Right? And listen to what happens in Matthew 14. Then Jesus got down out of the boat, walked on the water and came towards... Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Why did he doubt? Because sometimes the reality of the storm seems greater than the reality of Jesus. And that was his experience at that moment. Sometimes things come your way and you know you ought to be focusing on Jesus. You can see what he's doing. You can see what he's capable of. You see what he's doing through you. And then something comes around you. You go, oh, I don't know. And for Peter, in that moment, the reality of the storm was greater than the reality of Jesus. Was Peter forever a man of doubt? No. And in fact, in hindsight, he probably recognized that he should have had more faith in Jesus and been less concerned about the storm in that moment. But that was his reality in the moment, but it didn't define him. And if you've had doubts, let it be descriptive of a moment. Don't let it be prescriptive of your life. If you have doubts in a moment, don't let it define you. Understand that's human nature. If you have doubts, understand that we all have inherited paradigms or worldviews that have power or sway over us. Sometimes it's hard to fight them when God actually forces us to break out of the paradigms that we've inherited. And this day, above all days, sort of forces us to reconsider everything that we thought we knew. Because death is conquered and Jesus does rise from the grave and dead people do rise from the grave. And there is the possibility, there is the hope, there is the reality of life beyond the grave. That's what this day offers us. But it is human nature to doubt. And so if you have doubts, understand that's human, but don't be defined by your doubts. Back at Matthew 28, we're on that mountain. We're told that they have doubts, remember? We're told the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. What's really, really interesting is the next line isn't, and Jesus was really ticked off. It isn't like Jesus saying, for crying out loud, what more do I need to do? Right? It's not like Jesus rebuking them. He doesn't say, hey, get it together. He doesn't seem to be bothered by this at all. It seems like he understands that hey, sometimes there'll be this ebb and flow between worship and doubt. And so you know what the next thing that Jesus says? After that line that they doubted, then he came to them. And he gives them the Great Commission. He says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. And you know what happened? They went. They actually went. Probably some of them a little doubting. And they went and they did it, and all but John died an unnatural death. All but John died prematurely. And what happened from being that group of people, we got some worshipping and some doubting on the mountain, to being a group of people that went and go and did it, and they made disciple after disciple after disciple. And never once did they recant, never once did they say, we made this thing up. What happened? They just stepped forward, straddling the reality of worship and doubt, and they just stepped into it and said, we got enough. I think I know enough, and I'll just step into this moment. And what they discovered, that Jesus was with them, not physically. In Acts 1:8, he sent them the Holy Spirit. But he is with them, and he does sustain them, and he does give them the words, and he does give them peace when they need it, and he does give them strength when they feel weak. And he does everything that he said that he would. And see, could it be that doubts are not resolved with just a simple one-liner? So sometimes that doubts are resolved as we just step into this journey with God and say, I think I know enough. I'm going to straddle the reality between worship and doubt. I'm going to move with him. And somewhere along the line, you start to understand or experience the reality. Somewhere along the line, those questions get answered. I reckon if Peter had another chance to walk on water, I don't think the storm would worry him as much second time round. You see, doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's just part of the journey. It's part of the wrestle of what it means to be a person of faith living in this world. And doubt is just simply saying, not that I'm jettisoning everything about God, I just haven't got everything figured out yet. I've got these paradigms that keep pushing in on me, that keep wanting to tell me things ought to be different, and Jesus keeps challenging what I think I know. That's what it is to be human. C.S. Lewis in Christianity Explained puts it this way. Mere Christianity puts it this way. Now, faith in the sense in which I'm here using the word is the art of holding onto things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. For moods will change whatever view your reason takes. I know that by experience. Now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks terribly improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. Who doesn't love a good C.S. Lewis quote? Isn't that true? Let me say, when I was an atheist, I didn't believe in God, but sometimes I actually sort of did. Because now that I'm a Christian, there are times when I have my doubts. I have my questions, because that's what it is to be human, as part of the human experience. If you've had doubts along the way, don't be slave to your doubts. Don't let them limit you. Understand that you'll have this wrestle between sometimes you'll be at his feet worshipping, sometimes there'll be doubts. And maybe it's time to stop being a slave to your doubts and just take a tentative step with Jesus. To trust him. To be like the disciples on Matthew 28 at the top of the mountain going, I don't know. I'm sort of all in and then I'm not sure. But he says he can do this in and through us. I'm just going to start to take this step with him and see what happens. And it could be, for some of you, it could be that first step of faith to say, hey, I've been straddling this for too long. I think today's the day I'm just going to take a step with Jesus and see where this will lead. See if those doubts get resolved. For others of you, it might be, hey, the doubts have been taking my control of my life for far too long. And I want to actually be more of a worshipper and less of a doubter, and I'm going to start to change that part of my life. For others of you, know that God's been wanting to stretch you and push you, and yet you have these doubts. And sometimes the doubts aren't about Jesus, they're about you. Sometimes the doubts is like the storm just seems bigger. The mess of my life seems bigger than the reality of Jesus. And I feel like if I try, I will sink. Rather than just trust Jesus and step out and give it a go. Because there's always going to be doubts, there'll always be moments of uncertainty. C.S. Lewis knew it, Archbishop Welby knew it, and maybe you knew it, you know it. But I'll say today, make the choice today. Say, I'm no longer going to be a slave to doubt. I'm not going to flatten out the story of the resurrected Jesus anymore. It's too compelling. There's too much evidence. It makes too much of a difference for me to ignore it and keep flattening it out. I need to let it change my paradigm rather than me keep flattening this thing out. And just see what life God can have in and through you if you choose Him, if you let Him. Let me pray for us this morning. Father, I want to pray for a bunch of different people in terms of where we are this morning. Father, I want to pray for anyone here that has had doubts about you that have stopped them from ever giving themselves completely to you. That, Father, that you're a bit like Thomas, that you would reveal yourself in some way to them. Perhaps there's a question that needs to be answered, an experience that needs to be had. There's just something that would allow the faith that they've heard about, the faith that they've seen in others, become a faith that is real for them. So, Father, I pray for that experience for them. For others, Lord, that perhaps know you, but have been overwhelmed by the storms and the realities of this world, and it has stopped them from stepping out and trusting and being courageous in the invitations that you've had on their life to say things and to do things and to walk with you in a certain way, and they keep getting overwhelmed, and the doubts keep taking control of their life more than their focus on you, Lord. Father, my prayer would be that they would be encouraged by the story of Peter, and they'll be reminded that whilst it's human to doubt, the storms are not bigger than you. They're more powerful than you. You're the one who calms the storms. You're the one who does walk on the water. You're the one who can do anything in and through us. And for those that are just struggling to straddle the reality between worship and doubt and keep getting pulled toward doubt, that today would be an opportunity just to step more and more courageously into being a person of worship, a person who wants to worship you, who wants to fall at your feet. Not to pretend the doubt isn't there, but not to be overwhelmed by the doubt, to let the doubt sometimes be a catalyst for faith, to acknowledge that it's part of the human journey, but not to live in the doubt, to make the choice to say, I choose to worship, rather than be stymied by doubt. So, Father, my prayer this morning for all of us, that we'd all be transformed, that you would shake up our paradigm. Whatever ways we restrict you or limit you this morning, whatever worldview that is holding our hearts and mind hostage, that are keeping us from fully giving ourselves over to you, that you would shake those up this morning, Lord. And that we wouldn't flatten out your revelation to us, but we would allow it, the truth of you, to change us, rather than us trying to change the truth of you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.